The stranger's blood was already soaking through Harlan Briggs' only good blanket when he realized what he'd done. The Apache lay unconscious in his bed, chest rising in shallow breaths, a deep gash across his ribs, still seeping red onto the cotton sheets. Harlan stood in the doorway of his own bedroom, watching the massive man occupy the space where he'd slept alone for 6 years, and felt something cold settle in his stomach. Not fear exactly. Something worse. The kind of knowing that comes right before everything changes. Outside, 3 sets of boot prints led away from where he'd found the body. 3 men had left this Apache to die in the dirt, and Harlan had just made himself part of whatever came next. 40 minutes earlier, Harlan had been checking his fence line when he saw the buzzards circling. That's all it took to pull him off course. The dark shapes wheeling against the pale sky. He'd found livestock taken by coyotes that way before, found a drifter dead from heat exhaustion once. He never expected to find a man still breathing. The Apache had been face down in the dried grass, one arm stretched out like he'd been crawling. Harlan had stood there longer than he should have, just staring. The man was huge, easily the tallest person Harlan had ever seen, dressed in tribal clothing that marked him as unmistakably different from anyone who belonged in this territory. His back was soaked with blood from a wound that looked deliberate, purposeful. Someone had cut him and left him to bleed out slow. Harlan's first instinct had been to walk away, pretend he'd never seen anything. In these parts, getting involved with Apache business was a death sentence for men like him, ranchers trying to survive on the margins of civilization. The territorial tensions weren't just rumors, they were the daily reality. One wrong move, one misunderstood gesture, and you could lose everything. But then the Apache had made a sound, a low, pained rasp that cut through Harlan's indecision like a blade. The man was dying, right there in the grass, bleeding out while Harlan watched. And something in that moment, something Harlan couldn't name and would later curse himself for, made him drop to his knees beside the stranger. Getting the Apache back to the cabin had nearly broken Harlan's back. The man was dead weight, muscle and bone, impossibly heavy. Harlan had dragged him the first 100 yards, then had to stop and figure out how to get him onto his horse. It took 20 minutes of pulling and positioning before he managed it. The Apache's body draped across the saddle while Harlan walked alongside, one hand steadying the unconscious man to keep him from sliding off. By the time they reached the cabin, Harlan's shirt was soaked with sweat and someone else's blood. He'd pulled the Apache inside through the main room and made a decision he still didn't understand. Instead of laying him on the floor, instead of putting him anywhere else, Harlan had hauled him into the bedroom and lifted him onto the bed. His bed, the only bed. Now standing in the doorway, Harlan realized he couldn't remember the last time another person had been inside his home. 6 years of solitude, 6 years of careful isolation, and he'd just invited a stranger into the most private space he had. Not just any stranger, an Apache warrior who someone had tried to kill. Harlan moved to the bedside, hands hovering over the wound, not sure where to start. The gash was deep, running from the Apache's lower ribs across his side toward his back. It needed cleaning, needed stitching, needed more skill than Harlan possessed, but it needed something now, or the man would be dead by nightfall. He pressed a cloth against the wound, applying pressure the way he'd learned with injured animals. The Apache's eyes snapped open. For 3 seconds, neither man moved. The Apache's gaze locked onto Harlan's face, dark eyes wide with confusion and something that might have been terror. Then his hand shot out, fingers closing around Harlan's wrist with crushing strength. Harlan froze. The Apache was awake, disoriented, and clearly thought Harlan was a threat. The grip on his wrist tightened until Harlan felt bones grinding together. He didn't pull away, didn't fight, just held still and waited, meeting those eyes with as much calm as he could fake. The moment stretched out, both men locked in place. Then the Apache's gaze moved, taking in the room, the bed beneath him, the cloth pressed against his wound. His grip loosened slightly, confusion replacing the initial panic. He said something in a language Harlan didn't understand, voice rough and demanding. Harlan shook his head slowly. The Apache's eyes narrowed, studying him with an intensity that felt like being weighed and measured. Another question in that unfamiliar language, sharper this time. When Harlan didn't answer, couldn't answer, the Apache's jaw tightened. Then his eyes rolled back and he collapsed against the pillow, unconscious again. His hand fell away from Harlan's wrist, leaving red marks where his fingers had been. Harlan stood there breathing hard, staring at the massive stranger now sprawled in his bed. The wound was still bleeding. Outside, the sun was dropping toward the horizon. And somewhere out there, 3 men who'd tried to kill this Apache might realize he hadn't died where they'd left him. Harlan looked at his own wrist, at the bruises already forming, and then at the blood seeping through his blanket. He'd made his choice when he picked up that body in the grass. Now he just had to live with whatever came through his door because of it. Harlan worked through the night, his hands steady even as his mind raced with every terrible possibility. He cleaned the wound with whiskey, the same bottle he'd been saving for emergencies that never seemed important enough. This qualified. The gash was deeper than he'd first thought, the edges ragged like someone had used a dull blade and taken their time. Not a quick slice meant to kill fast, this was meant to hurt. He stitched what he could with thread meant for repairing saddles, each pull of the needle making his stomach turn. The Apache never woke, his breathing shallow but consistent. Harlan had seen enough injured animals to know the difference between dying and fighting to live. This man was fighting, his body working to survive even while unconscious. By the time dawn light started filtering through the cabin windows, Harlan had done everything he knew how to do. Fresh bandages wrapped tight around the Apache's ribs, the bleeding finally stopped. He'd given him water, just small amounts, letting it drip between cracked lips. The fever would come soon. That's what always happened with wounds like this. Harlan sat in the chair beside his bed, watching the stranger's chest rise and fall, and tried to understand what he'd gotten himself into. The man's clothing told stories Harlan couldn't fully read. The leather was worked with patterns he'd seen before. From a distance, when Apache groups passed through the far edges of the territory, the beadwork on his chest piece was intricate, precise. This wasn't just any Apache. This was someone important. That made everything worse. When the sun was fully up, Harlan forced himself to move. He walked outside, scanning the horizon with eyes that had learned to read danger in the landscape. Nothing moved except wind through dry grass. No dust clouds, no riders. The 3 sets of boot prints he'd seen yesterday were still there, leading north toward the trading route. Whoever had done this was long gone, or waiting. Harlan went to the small corral behind the cabin where his 2 horses stood, checking their water, their feed, making sure everything looked normal. Routine was important now. If anyone came by, if anyone was watching, they needed to see a man going about his regular day, not someone hiding something, not someone whose hands still had another man's blood dried under his fingernails. He was heading back to the cabin when he noticed it. His woodpile, the stack he'd spent 2 weeks building up for winter, had been disturbed. Not obviously, just enough that someone who knew how he kept things would see it. 3 logs pulled out from the bottom, creating a gap. Harlan's blood went cold. Someone had been here while he was gone yesterday. While he was hauling the Apache back to the cabin, someone had searched his property. They'd been careful, quiet, but they'd been here, looking for something, or someone. He walked to the woodpile slowly, keeping his movements casual, aware that eyes might still be watching. When he reached it, he saw what they'd left. Not a message. Something worse. A strip of leather cut clean, with Apache beadwork along the edge. The same pattern he'd seen on the unconscious man's clothing. They knew. Whoever had cut the Apache and left him to die, they knew Harlan had found him. They knew he'd brought him here, and they'd left proof that they could come back any time they wanted. Harlan picked up the leather strip, feeling its weight in his hand. His mind calculated distances, time, possibilities. The men couldn't have known for certain that the Apache would crawl in this direction. They couldn't have predicted Harlan would find him, which meant they'd searched multiple properties, multiple homesteads, checking to see if anyone had been foolish enough to interfere. And Harlan had been exactly that foolish. He stood there in his yard, the morning sun warming his shoulders, holding evidence of his own mistake. The smart thing would be to load the Apache onto a horse right now, take him far from here, leave him somewhere with water and ride away. Claim ignorance if anyone asked. Say he never saw anything. But Harlan's eyes moved to the cabin door, to the bedroom window where a man lay unconscious in his bed, helpless and bleeding. A man who'd already survived being cut open and left to die, who was fighting even now to stay alive. The smart thing and the right thing weren't always the same. Harlan tucked the leather strip into his pocket and walked back inside. The Apache was still unconscious, fever starting to flush his dark skin. Harlan dipped a cloth in cool water and pressed it to the man's forehead, watching for any sign of waking. When those eyes finally opened again, When questions started getting asked in a language he couldn't understand, Harlan would need to have answers ready. About who he was, about why he'd helped, about what came next. But first, he needed to figure out who was hunting this man, and why they wanted him dead badly enough to track him to a stranger's cabin. The Apache woke screaming. Harlan dropped the water bucket, lunging toward the bedroom as the sound tore through the cabin. When he burst through the door, the Apache was sitting upright, one hand clutched to his bandaged ribs, the other reaching for something that wasn't there. His eyes were wild, unfocused, seeing something that wasn't in the room. Then those eyes found Harlan. The scream cut off. The Apache went absolutely still, his breathing rapid and shallow. For 5 long seconds, neither man moved. Then the Apache spoke, his voice rough, but the English clear enough to understand. "Who are you?" Harlan hadn't expected English. The surprise must have shown on his face because the Apache's expression hardened, his whole body tensing despite the obvious pain it caused. "I asked who you are." "Harlan Briggs." He stayed near the doorway, hands visible, non-threatening. "This is my cabin. I found you yesterday bleeding out in the grass about 2 miles north. You've been unconscious since I brought you here." The Apache's eyes moved, taking in the room, the bandages wrapped around his torso, the blood-stained sheets beneath him. His hand went to the wound, fingers probing carefully. When he pulled them away, there was no fresh blood. He looked at Harlan again, this time with something other than hostility. Confusion, maybe. Suspicion. Why? Why what? Why bring me here? Why not leave me where you found me? Harlan didn't have a good answer for that. Not one that made sense even to himself. He shrugged. "You were dying. Men die. Not on my land if I can help it." The Apache studied him for another long moment, then winced and eased himself back down onto the pillow. The movement clearly cost him, sweat breaking out across his forehead. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter. "My name is Nakoma, and you should not have helped me." "Why not?" "Because now they will come for you too." There it was. Confirmation of what Harlan had already suspected. He moved into the room, keeping his distance but close enough to talk. "Who will come?" Nakoma's jaw tightened. "Did anyone see you bring me here?" "No. But someone came while I was gone. They searched my property, left a piece of your clothing where I'd find it. They know you're here." Something flickered across Nakoma's face. Not surprise. Resignation. He closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again. "Then you need to take me outside and leave me. Tell them you tried to help, but I died. Tell them whatever they need to hear. But you cannot keep me here. Too late for that." "It is not too late. I can still walk. I can." "You can barely sit up without bleeding through your stitches." Harlan crossed his arms. "You're not going anywhere for at least 3 days. Maybe longer. Then in 3 days you will be dead." Nakoma's voice was flat, matter of fact. "The men who did this, they do not stop, they do not forget, and they do not leave witnesses." "What did you see? What did they do that's worth killing over?" Nakoma turned his head away, looking at the wall. "You do not want that knowledge. It will only make your death more certain. I think I earned the right to know when I spent all night stitching you back together." For a long moment, Nakoma said nothing. Then, still looking at the wall, he spoke. 3 days ago, I was hunting near the southern pass. I saw men with a wagon, military men, but not in uniform. They had something in that wagon. Someone. A girl, maybe 14, 15 years old. Apache. She was screaming, fighting them. He stopped, his jaw working. "They laughed while they hurt her, and when I tried to stop them, this happened." Harlan felt something cold settle in his chest. "They cut you and left you to die because you tried to help a girl. Not just any girl. The daughter of Tahini, our peace chief. The one man who has kept our people from open conflict with the settlements. If she dies, if she is harmed, there will be no more peace. Only response. And whoever has her knows this." Nakoma finally looked back at Harlan. "They want conflict. They want Apache to strike first so they can justify what comes next. And I am the only witness who knows the truth." The pieces were falling into place now, creating a picture Harlan wished he couldn't see. Military men, out of uniform, taking a chief's daughter, starting a conflict that would benefit someone with power, someone who wanted these lands cleared and didn't care how it happened. That's why they're hunting you, not just to kill you, to make sure you can't tell anyone what you saw. Yes, And now that you have helped me, you are part of this. Nakoma's voice held no anger, just tired certainty. The moment they find me here, you become a traitor to your own people. They will not ask questions. They will not hear your reasons. They will simply ensure you cannot speak. Harlan walked to the window, looking out at his land, his cabin, his simple life that had been quiet and safe until yesterday. The smart thing would be to do exactly what Nakoma suggested. Put him on a horse, ride him far enough away, come back and claim ignorance. But there was a girl out there somewhere, 14 or 15 years old, taken by men who wanted to start a conflict that would consume this entire territory. And the only man who could prove the truth was bleeding in Harlan's bed, telling him to run and save himself. Harlan turned back to Nakoma. How long do we have before they come back? You should not. How long? Nakoma's eyes narrowed, studying Harlan's face like he was trying to solve a puzzle. Finally, he answered. They will search every homestead within riding distance. If they are thorough, maybe 2 days. If they are desperate, less. Then we have 2 days to figure out what we're going to do when they arrive. We? Nakoma's voice held disbelief. There is no we. You owe me nothing. You should… That girl. Where were they taking her? Nakoma was quiet for a moment. North, toward the old fort. But the fort has been abandoned for months. They must have a camp there, somewhere isolated where no one would hear her. Harlan nodded slowly, his mind working through logistics he didn't want to consider but couldn't ignore. Can you ride? In 2 days? Maybe. If I do not die of fever first. Then that's what we prepare for. Harlan moved toward the door, then stopped and looked back. And Nakoma? Those men made one big mistake. What mistake? They left you alive long enough for someone like me to find you. Harlan's voice was quiet, but certain. That means they're not as smart as they think they are, and that gives us something to work with. He walked out of the bedroom, leaving Nakoma staring after him, confusion, and something that might have been hope flickering across his face. Outside, the sun was climbing toward midday. Somewhere out there, men were searching, and somewhere else, a girl was running out of time. Harlan had 2 days to make sure both problems got solved, or die trying. The fever hit Nakoma hard on the second morning. Harlan had expected it, but that didn't make watching it any easier. The Apache thrashed in the bed, muttering in his own language, his skin burning hot under Harlan's hand. Every few hours, Harlan would get him to drink water, small sips that he'd swallow without fully waking. The wound was clean, showing no signs of infection, but the body was fighting something deeper. The kind of fight that happened inside where no medicine could reach. Harlan worked while Nakoma fought his fever. He moved his rifle closer to the door, checked his ammunition, counted rounds he hadn't touched in months, made sure his horse was saddled and ready in the corral, a pack with supplies already tied behind the saddle. If they had to run, they needed to run fast. By midday, he heard horses, 3 riders, coming from the north. Harlan watched them through the window, his hand resting on the rifle. They weren't trying to hide their approach, which meant they wanted him to know they were coming, wanted him to have time to think about what that meant. He recognized the lead rider, Thomas Gentry, a man who'd claimed to work for the Territorial Supply Company, but everyone knew had other business, the kind of business that happened in darkness and left bodies behind. The 2 men with him were younger, harder, the type who followed orders without asking questions. Harlan stepped outside before they reached the cabin, standing in his yard with empty hands visible. The rifle was inside, leaning against the doorframe close enough if he needed it, but not close enough to look threatening. Gentry reined in his horse 20 feet away, his eyes scanning the property with the practiced look of a man searching for lies. Harlan Briggs. Been a while. Gentry. Harlan kept his voice neutral. What brings you out this way? Looking for someone. Apache man. Big fellow. Probably wounded. You seen anyone like that? No. Gentry smiled, but there was nothing friendly in it. That's interesting, because we tracked him to about 2 miles north of here. Then the trail got confused, like maybe someone found him and moved him. Lots of riders pass through this territory. Could have been anyone. Could have been. Gentry shifted in his saddle, his hand resting casually near the pistol at his hip. Mind if we take a look around? Just to be sure. It wasn't a request. Harlan knew that, but he also knew that once they searched the cabin and found Nakoma, everything ended. They'd kill the Apache, kill Harlan for hiding him, and ride away like nothing happened. The girl would stay missing. The truth would stay buried. I do mind, actually. Harlan's voice stayed calm. This is private property. You've got no authority here. One of the younger men spurred his horse forward, but Gentry held up a hand, stopping him. His eyes never left Harlan's face. You sure you want to play this game? We're not asking for much. Just a quick look, unless you've got something to hide. I've got privacy to keep, same as any man. The tension stretched out between them, thick enough to choke on. Harlan could feel sweat running down his back despite the cool morning air. Behind him, inside the cabin, Nakoma lay unconscious and helpless. If they pushed past him, if they searched the bedroom, it was over. Gentry studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. All right, Briggs. We'll respect your privacy. For now. He turned his horse, but paused before riding away. But you should know something. That Apache we're looking for, he's wanted for attacking military personnel. Anyone helping him, hiding him, that's the same as attacking us yourself. You understand what I'm saying? I understand you're looking for someone who isn't here. Right. Gentry's smile got colder. We'll be checking with other homesteads nearby. If we find out anyone's seen something they're not telling us about, well, that's going to be a problem for them. He leaned forward in his saddle. A fatal problem. The three riders turned and headed west, toward the Miller property 5 miles away. Harlan stood in his yard, watching them go, his heart hammering in his chest. They'd believed him, or at least, they'd chosen to move on for now. But the threat was clear. They'd be back, and next time, they wouldn't be asking permission. He waited until the riders were out of sight before going back inside. Nakoma was awake, his fever-bright eyes fixed on the ceiling. I heard. His voice was rough, barely above a whisper. You should have let them search. You should have told them I was here. And watched them put a bullet in your head in my own bedroom? No thanks. They will come back. You know this. I know. Harlan sat down heavily in the chair beside the bed. Which means we're out of time. You need to be able to ride by tomorrow morning. I cannot. You have to. Harlan's voice was harder than he meant it to be. Those men are going to hit the Miller place next. Then the Johnsons after that. When they don't find you there, they'll circle back here with more men and less patience. We've got maybe 24 hours before this cabin becomes a trap. Nakoma closed his eyes. His jaw clenched against pain or frustration or both. The girl. We cannot leave without knowing. I know where the old fort is. I know how to get there. Harlan stood up, moving to the window, checking the horizon again. But we can't help her if we're dead. So tomorrow morning, fever or no fever, bleeding or not, you're getting on a horse. We ride north, we find that fort, and we end this. End this? How? It is just the two of us against trained men with weapons. Then we better be smarter than them. Nakoma opened his eyes again, looking at Harlan with something that might have been respect, or might have been pity. You are a rancher, not a fighter. This is not your battle. It became my battle the moment I put you in my bed. Harlan turned from the window. That's the mistake everyone keeps talking about, isn't it? Offering help when I should have walked away, getting involved when I should have stayed isolated. But here's the thing about mistakes. Sometimes they're the only honest choice you've got. Outside, the sun was starting its descent toward evening. Tomorrow before dawn they'd ride. Toward the old fort, toward danger, toward whatever end this story was always going to have. Harlan just hoped when the end came, that girl would be alive to see it. They came back at midnight. Harlan heard the horses before he saw them, that soft thunder of hooves on hard ground that meant riders moving fast. He was already awake, sitting in the darkness with his rifle across his lap, waiting for something he knew was coming but hoped would take longer to arrive. 4 riders this time. Not Gentry and his 2 men. Different men. Harder men. The kind you sent when talking was over, and only one outcome mattered. Harlan moved to the bedroom where Nakoma was struggling to sit up, his face pale but his eyes clear. The fever had broken an hour ago, leaving him weak but lucid. They are here. It wasn't a question. 4 of them. We've got maybe 2 minutes before they reach the door. Harlan's mind was calculating, measuring chances that all came out bad. Can you stand? Nakoma pushed himself up, swaying but staying on his feet. I can fight. That's not what I asked. It is the only answer that matters now. The horses stopped outside. Harlan heard boots hitting ground, heard low voices conferring. They weren't going to knock, weren't going to ask permission. They were going to come through that door ready to kill whatever they found. Harlan moved to the window, peering through the gap in the curtain. The 4 men were spreading out, surrounding the cabin. Professional, practiced. This wasn't their first time clearing out a problem. The back window. Harlan kept his voice low. You can make it to the tree line if you move now. Take my horse from the corral, ride north. Don't stop until you're in Apache territory. And you? I'll hold them here, give you time. Nakoma's hand shot out, gripping Harlan's arm with surprising strength. That is death, maybe. But it's better than both of us dying for nothing. There is another choice. What choice? Nakoma's eyes were hard, certain. We both go. Now. Before they breach the door. They'll hear us. They'll chase us down. Then we make them chase us towards something that matters. The fort. We lead them there. We force them to show us where the girl is. Nakoma's grip tightened. You want to save her. This is how. We make ourselves the target they cannot ignore. Harlan's mind raced through the logistics. It was insane. It was suicide. It was also the only plan that gave them any chance at all. If they ran now, led the men north, they might reach the fort before being caught. Might force a confrontation on ground they chose instead of ground chosen for them. A fist hammered on the cabin door. Harlan Briggs. We know he's in there. Send him out and maybe we don't burn this place down with you inside it. Harlan looked at Nakoma, saw the determination in those dark eyes, and made his choice. Again. The same choice he'd been making since he found a dying man in the grass. The choice to do something instead of nothing, even when nothing would be safer. Back window. We move silent and fast. You follow me. Stay low. And if I tell you to run, you run. Understood? Nakoma nodded once. They moved through the cabin in darkness. Harlan leading. Nakoma following despite the obvious pain each step caused. The back window opened quietly. Hinges Harlan had kept oiled for exactly this kind of emergency he'd never actually expected to need. Outside, the night air was cold and clear. The corral was 30 yards away. Harlan's horse was already saddled, still ready from this afternoon. Nakoma's weight on his wounded side made him slower, but they covered the distance, keeping the cabin between them and the men at the front door. The pounding came again, harder. Last chance, Briggs. Harlan got Nakoma onto the horse first, then swung up behind him. The Apache leaned forward over the horse's neck, making room. Harlan dug his heels in, and the horse bolted toward the tree line. Behind them, someone shouted. Then the gunfire started. Rounds kicked up dirt around the horse's hooves. Something whistled past Harlan's ear close enough to feel. He leaned low, pushing the horse faster, heading for the darkness under the trees. Nakoma's back was pressed against his chest. The Apache's breathing labored, but steady. They hit the tree line at a full gallop, branches whipping past. More shots behind them, but the darkness in the trees made them harder targets. Harlan heard the men mounting up, heard orders being shouted. The chase had begun. He guided the horse north, toward the old fort, toward whatever waited there. Beside him, Nakoma kept his grip on the horse's mane, his body tensed against pain but refusing to fall. You should have let me die in the grass. Nakoma's voice was barely audible over the pounding hooves. Probably. You should have turned me over to Gentry. Definitely. So why did you not? Harlan didn't have a good answer. Or maybe he had too many answers and none of them made sense even to himself. He'd offered his bed to a stranger, had given up his safety, his peace, maybe his life. For what? For principle? For stubbornness? For the simple, stupid belief that you didn't watch someone die when you could do something about it? The mistake everyone kept talking about. The greatest mistake of his life. Except it didn't feel like a mistake. It felt like the first honest thing he'd done in years. Behind them, the riders were closing distance. Ahead, somewhere in the darkness, a girl was waiting to be saved or avenged. And between those 2 points, Harlan Briggs rode through the night with a wounded Apache pressed against his back. Both of them heading toward an end neither could predict, but both had chosen. The old fort was 3 hours north. They had maybe half that before the riders caught up. It would have to be enough. The old fort materialized from the darkness like a skeleton rising from the earth. Stone walls crumbling at the corners, wooden watchtower leaning at an angle that shouldn't support weight, but somehow did. Harlan had passed this place a dozen times over the years, always from a distance, always assuming it was nothing but abandoned ruins. He'd been wrong. Light flickered from inside the fort's central courtyard. Not firelight, lamplight, controlled, contained, the kind you used when you didn't want to be seen from far away but needed to see what you were doing up close. And there were horses, 6 of them tied to a makeshift rail near what used to be the main gate. Harlan pulled his horse to a stop 100 yards out, behind a cluster of rocks that gave them cover and a view. Nakoma slid down first, moving stiffly but managing to stay on his feet. The ride had cost him, fresh blood seeping through the bandages beneath his shirt, but his eyes were sharp, focused. 6 horses. Nakoma's voice was quiet. At least 6 men inside, plus the 4 chasing us. Harlan dismounted, keeping low. They'll be here soon, 20 minutes at most. Then we have 20 minutes to get her out. Harlan studied the fort's layout, what he could see of it. The main gate hung open, one of its massive wooden doors missing entirely. The walls were maybe 12 feet high, stone and mortar that looked solid enough despite the years. 2 entrances he could see from this angle, maybe more on the far side. We go in there blind. We're dead before we find her. Harlan tied his horse's reins to a low branch. We need to know where she is first. Which building? Which room? Nakoma nodded toward the eastern wall where a section had collapsed, leaving a gap about 3 feet wide. I can get through there. Work my way around the inside. Find her location. Come back. You're barely standing. I have been barely standing since you found me. It has not stopped me yet. Nakoma met his eyes. This is what I came here to do. What I nearly died trying to do 3 days ago. Let me finish it. Harlan wanted to argue, wanted to find a better plan, but he could hear hoofbeats in the distance. Faint, but getting louder. The riders were coming. Time was running out faster than he'd calculated. 10 minutes. Harlan pulled his rifle from the saddle. You're not back in 10 minutes. I'm coming in after you. Nakoma moved toward the collapsed wall, keeping to shadows, his movements surprisingly quiet for someone who should be writhing in pain. Harlan watched him disappear through the gap, then turned his attention back to the approaching sound. 3 riders, not 4. They'd split up. Smart. Probably sent one man to circle around, cut off any escape route. Harlan settled behind the rocks, rifle ready, and waited. The 3 riders slowed as they approached the fort, their horses nervous, sensing something wrong. Harlan recognized one of them from earlier. The young one who'd moved forward when Gentry told him to stay back. Eager. Dangerous because he was trying to prove something. They stopped 50 yards from the fort's entrance, conferring in low voices Harlan couldn't make out. Then one of them dismounted and started walking toward the main gate on foot, leaving his horse with the others. Checking the perimeter, making sure no one had gotten past them. Harlan counted seconds in his head. Nakoma had been gone 4 minutes. 6 minutes left before Harlan had to move. The rider on foot was getting closer to the fort's entrance, his hand on his pistol, every step cautious. Then Harlan heard it. A scream from inside the fort. Female. Young. Cut off almost as soon as it started, like someone had covered her mouth. But it was enough. Enough to tell him she was alive. Enough to tell him where she was. And enough to make the rider on foot break into a run toward the entrance. The other 2 riders spurred their horses forward, weapons drawn. Whatever stealth they'd been maintaining was gone. That scream had changed everything. Had pulled them into action before they were ready. Harlan made his choice. He stood up from behind the rocks and fired. The shot took the lead rider's horse in the leg. The animal screamed and went down hard, throwing its rider. Harlan didn't wait to see where the man landed. He was already moving, running toward the fort's side wall where Nakoma had disappeared. Gunfire erupted behind him. Rounds punched into the dirt at his feet, whined off rocks. He dove through the collapsed section of wall, hitting hard on the other side, rolling to his feet in the fort's courtyard. The scene inside made his blood run cold. 6 men, just like Nakoma had counted. But they weren't soldiers. They weren't even dressed like military. They were dressed like ranchers, like townsmen, like any other settlers you'd see on the street. Regular people doing irregular things. And in the center of the courtyard, tied to a post with her hands bound above her head, was the girl. She couldn't have been more than 15, her Apache clothing torn, her face bruised, her eyes wide with terror that hadn't quite killed the defiance in them. 2 of the 6 men were already turning toward Harlan, drawing weapons. The others were looking toward the main gate where the commotion was happening. No one had seen Nakoma yet. That changed when Nakoma stepped out from behind one of the fort's interior buildings, a length of wood from the ruined structure in his hands. He swung it like a club, catching one of the men across the back of the head. The man went down hard. Chaos erupted. The remaining 5 men scattered, some going for the girl, some going for cover, some just trying to process what was happening. Harlan fired twice more, deliberately high, trying to drive them back rather than kill them. He wasn't a killer. Didn't want to be. But he would be if that's what it took. Nakoma was moving toward the girl, his makeshift weapon still in hand. One of the men raised a pistol toward him. Harlan fired, this time not high. The round caught the man in the shoulder and spun him around. Then the 3 riders from outside were coming through the main gate, and the situation went from chaos to something worse. Harlan dove behind a pile of rubble as bullets tore through the space where he'd been standing. Nakoma reached the girl, cutting her bonds with a knife he'd somehow acquired. She collapsed against him, and he caught her with his free arm, his face showing the cost of that simple movement. "Harlan!" Nakoma's voice carried across the courtyard. "We need to leave. Now!" But the main gate was blocked. The eastern gap was too far, and the men inside the fort were recovering from their surprise, spreading out, surrounding them. Harlan looked at Nakoma holding the girl, both of them exposed in the center of the courtyard, looked at the men closing in from all sides, looked at his rifle with maybe 6 rounds left. The greatest mistake of his life, everyone said. Offering his bed to a stranger, looking at that terrified girl finally free from her post, looking at Nakoma standing despite wounds that should have killed him. Harlan thought maybe the mistake wasn't what everyone assumed. Maybe the mistake was thinking he could save everyone and walk away clean. Some prices had to be paid in full. The standoff lasted exactly 3 seconds before Thomas Gentry walked through the main gate. He held no weapon, didn't need to. The 8 men positioned around the courtyard had enough firepower to end this a dozen different ways. Gentry just walked in calm as Sunday morning, his hands loose at his sides, his eyes taking in the scene with something that looked like disappointment. "Harlan Briggs." Gentry stopped in the center of the courtyard, 10 feet from where Nakoma stood holding the girl. "I really hoped you were smarter than this." Harlan kept his rifle trained on the nearest man, knowing it wouldn't matter if shooting started but needing the weight of it in his hands anyway. "Let them go, Gentry. This is between you and me." "Between us?" Gentry laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Son, you don't even understand what this is. You think you're rescuing some girl, playing hero? You just stepped into something that's been years in the making. I know what I stepped into. You took a chief's daughter to start a conflict. Make it look like Apache attacked first so you can justify clearing the territory. See, that's where you're wrong." Gentry pulled a folded paper from his jacket pocket. "This right here is a deed, signed by the territorial governor himself. Gives mineral rights to everything from here to the southern pass. You know what's under that land? Copper, silver, maybe gold. Enough to make a dozen men rich for life." He tucked the paper away. "But we can't mine it with Apache in the way, and we can't move them legally, so we needed a reason, a good reason, the kind that makes everyone look the other way while we do what needs doing." The girl in Nakoma's arms stiffened, understanding the words even if she couldn't respond. Nakoma's grip on her tightened, his other hand still holding the knife he'd used to cut her bonds. "So you take a chief's daughter." Harlan's voice was steady despite the rage building in his chest. "Hurt her. Make it look like settlers did it. Wait for her people to retaliate so you can cry massacre and bring in the military. That's oversimplifying it, but essentially, yes." Gentry gestured around the courtyard. "These men you see here, they're all investors, all standing to make fortunes once the land gets cleared. Some of them own businesses in town. Some of them are respected citizens, and every single one of them agreed this was the best way forward." He looked at Harlan with something almost like pity. "You can't fight the tide, Briggs. This was always going to happen. You just made it messier by getting involved. Then I guess I'll make it messier still." Harlan shifted his aim toward Gentry. Every gun in the courtyard immediately trained on him. He could feel the tension, that moment before violence when everyone's calculating whether they'll survive the next 10 seconds. "You shoot me, you die." Gentry's voice was flat. "Then Nakoma dies. Then the girl dies. And tomorrow, my men ride into Apache territory, show them her body, and tell them settlers did it. The outcome is the same. You just decide whether you get to see it or not. There is another outcome." Nakoma's voice cut through the tension. "I tell my people the truth. Tell them what I witnessed. Tell them about you and your deed and your plan. They will know who the real enemy is. Your people won't believe you. Not when we show them their chief's daughter with bullets from settler weapons. Not when we have a dozen witnesses ready to swear they saw Apache attacking innocent ranchers." Gentry smiled. "You lose, Nakoma. You lost 3 days ago when we cut you open and left you to die. You just haven't accepted it yet." The girl suddenly spoke, her voice small but clear. English, with an accent. My father will know. He will know I speak truth. Your father will be too busy mourning to think straight, and too busy fighting to ask questions. Gentry's expression hardened. Last chance, Briggs. Put down the rifle. Walk away. You're just a rancher who got caught up in something. We can make this story work without you in it, but you have to choose right now. Harlan looked at Nakoma, saw the blood soaking through his shirt, saw the exhaustion in his eyes, looked at the girl trembling against him, her face bruised but her spine straight, looked at the 8 guns pointed at them from every angle. The smart choice was obvious. Put down the rifle. Walk away. Live to see tomorrow. But Harlan had stopped making smart choices 3 days ago, when he picked up a dying Apache in the grass, when he offered his bed, when he stitched wounds and hid evidence and lied to dangerous men. Every choice since then had been steering toward this moment, this courtyard, this decision. Here's the thing about mistakes, Gentry. Harlan's fingers stayed on the trigger. Sometimes you make them and regret it. Sometimes you make them and realize they weren't mistakes at all. They were just the first honest thing you've done in a long time. Gentry sighed. Shame. You seemed like a reasonable man. He nodded to his men. Everything happened at once. Harlan dove left as the first shots rang out. Nakoma moved right, pulling the girl behind a pile of old supply crates. Bullets tore through the air where they'd been standing. Harlan fired twice, saw one man go down, then rolled behind the rubble pile. The courtyard erupted into chaos, men shouting, guns firing, smoke filling the space. Harlan couldn't see Nakoma or the girl. Couldn't see anything except muzzle flashes and shadows moving through dust. He fired again, conserving rounds, making each one count. Someone screamed. Something crashed. Then he heard it, cutting through the noise. Hoofbeats. A lot of them. Coming fast from the south. The firing stopped as everyone heard it. Men froze, turning toward the sound. Even Gentry looked uncertain for the first time since walking into the courtyard. Harlan risked a glance over the rubble pile. What he saw made his heart stop. Riders. 20 of them at least, maybe more. Apache warriors in full dress, weapons ready, faces painted for conflict. Led by a man whose presence commanded instant attention even from 100 yards away. Older, his face lined with years and authority. The chief, Nakoma's chief, the girl's father. He'd found them, and from the look on Gentry's face, that wasn't part of anyone's plan. The Apache warriors surrounded the fort in seconds, weapons drawn, faces hard with controlled fury. The chief dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate, his eyes scanning the courtyard until they found what they were looking for. His daughter. The girl broke from Nakoma's grip and ran. Not away from her father, but toward him, stumbling over rubble, her bound hands finally free, her voice breaking as she called out in her own language. The chief caught her, wrapped her in his arms, and for just a moment his expression cracked, showing the father beneath the leader. Then his eyes found Nakoma, battered and bleeding, standing in the center of the courtyard. Recognition flashed across his face, followed by something harder, questions that needed answers. Nakoma spoke in Apache, his voice carrying across the courtyard. Harlan couldn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. Report. Explanation. Truth. The chief listened without interrupting, his face growing darker with each sentence. When Nakoma finished, he gestured toward Gentry and his men. The chief spoke one word. Sharp. Final. Gentry must have understood it because he backed up a step, his hand moving toward his pistol. Now wait just a minute. Whatever he told you, it's lies. We found your daughter being held by settlers. We were bringing her back to you. The girl pulled away from her father and spoke rapidly in Apache, gesturing toward Gentry, toward the post where she'd been tied, toward the men who'd held her. Her voice rose, anger and pain bleeding through. When she finished, she switched to English, her words deliberate and clear. These men hurt me. These men took me, not settlers. Them. The chief's expression went cold. He spoke again, and his warriors moved forward, surrounding Gentry and the 8 remaining men. Weapons were stripped away, hands were bound. One of Gentry's investors tried to run and was brought down hard. No shots fired, no mercy shown. Gentry looked at Harlan, and for the first time fear showed in his eyes. You don't understand what you've done. That deed is legal. The governor will send the military. This won't end with us. Maybe not. Harlan lowered his rifle finally, exhaustion hitting him like a wave. But it ends with you. The chief issued orders, and his warriors began moving the prisoners toward their horses. Gentry was still talking, still threatening, still trying to negotiate his way out of consequences that had been coming for 3 days. Nobody was listening. The chief approached Harlan, the girl at his side, Nakoma limping behind them. When he spoke, his English was better than Harlan expected. "You are the rancher, the one who helped my warrior when he should have died. I'm just a man who made a choice that cost you much." The chief gestured toward the direction of Harlan's cabin. "My people passed your home on the way here. It burns. Gentry's men, the ones we did not find, they burned it before riding north to warn him." Harlan felt something hollow open in his chest. His cabin, 6 years of solitude, of peace, of careful isolation, gone. Everything he'd built, everything he'd protected reduced to ash because he'd offered his bed to a stranger. The greatest mistake of his life. Except when he looked at the girl standing safe beside her father, when he saw Nakoma alive despite wounds that should have killed him, when he thought about the truth finally spoken instead of buried. It didn't feel like a mistake at all. "I'm sorry for your loss." The chief's voice was genuine. "But I am grateful for your choice. My daughter lives because of it. My people will know the truth because of it. And justice will be served because of it." He paused. "You cannot return to settler territory. They will call you traitor for helping Apache. And you cannot stay here, not safely. But there is a place. North, beyond the pass where the land is empty and a man could build again. My people would not disturb you there. We would call you friend." Harlan looked at the horizon, trying to picture what came next. No cabin, no life of quiet isolation, no pretending the world's problems weren't his concern. Just open land and the memory of choices that had felt wrong until they'd turned out to be the only thing right. Nakoma stepped forward, extending his hand. Harlan took it, feeling the strength still there despite everything. "You gave me your bed when you should have walked away. You gave me your safety when you should have protected yourself. You gave me a chance when I was already dead." Nakoma's grip tightened. "My people have a word for this. For the man who sacrifices everything for another's justice. It means honored fool. It is a compliment. Honored fool." Harlan tested the words. "Yeah, that sounds about right." The girl approached, her bruises visible in the growing dawn light, her eyes still carrying trauma that would take time to heal. But she was alive. She was free. And that had to count for something. She spoke in halting English. "Thank you. For my life. For stopping them. Thank them." Harlan nodded toward Nakoma and her father. "I just offered a bed to a stranger. Everything else was just trying not to regret it." The sun was fully up now, burning away the last shadows in the courtyard. The Apache warriors were mounted, prisoners secured, ready to ride. The chief and his daughter prepared to leave. Nakoma stood beside Harlan, watching them prepare for departure. "Will you come north?" Nakoma asked. "Build again?" Harlan thought about his burned cabin, his ruined peace, his simple life that was never coming back. Thought about the alternative, the empty land beyond the pass. No neighbors, no trouble, just silence and space and the knowledge that when it mattered, he'd chosen right over easy. "Yeah." Harlan picked up his rifle, checking it out of habit. "Yeah, I'll come north." They rode out together as the sun climbed higher, leaving the old fort behind, leaving the bodies and the blood, and the confrontation that had been inevitable since the moment Harlan found a dying Apache in the grass. The greatest mistake of his life, everyone would say, offering his bed to a giant Apache stranger. But Harlan knew different now. The mistake wasn't the offering. The mistake was thinking he could keep living half a life, eyes closed to injustice, heart closed to anything that might cost him his peace. Sometimes the greatest mistake is discovering you can't unknow what you know, can't unsee what you've seen, can't go back to being the man who would have walked past a dying stranger and called it wisdom. Harlan Briggs rode north toward empty land and an uncertain future, and for the first time in 6 years, he felt like he was finally heading in the right direction. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale from the frontier, where courage and conscience collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.